My daughter-in-law canceled my 68th birthday, smiled as if it meant nothing, and told me nobody had time for an old woman's celebration anymore. Then she laughed and added, "Honestly, Margaret, nobody really cares about birthdays at your age." My son stood beside her, folded his arms, and quietly said, "Mom, you're 68. Why does this even matter?" My daughter looked down at the floor and said nothing at all. That silence hurt far more than the words. I honestly believed I would spend that birthday alone with nothing but an untouched cake from the grocery store and a photograph of my late husband. But life has a strange way of revealing who truly sees your worth when the people closest to you forget it. A few weeks later, the same woman who dismissed my birthday stood on my front porch with tears running down her face, whispering words I never imagined I would hear. "Please, Mom, forgive me." By then, something inside me had already changed forever. Before I tell you how we reached that moment, I'd love to know where you're watching from today and what your local time is right now, only if this story truly resonates with you. Stories have a funny way of connecting strangers who understand the same quiet kind of heartbreak. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and until that evening, I believed I understood exactly what family meant. I live in Carmel by the Sea, California, in the little white cottage my husband Robert and I bought nearly 30 years ago. Every hydrangea blooming along the walkway has his fingerprints in its history. Every creaking floorboard reminds me of another season we shared together. Robert passed away 9 years ago after a short battle with pancreatic cancer. But even now, I still find myself making 2 cups of coffee before remembering there is only one person left to drink it. Birthdays had always been our quiet tradition, nothing extravagant. Robert would wake up early, disappear for half an hour, and somehow return carrying fresh flowers that looked as though they had been picked just moments before. He always insisted on baking the cake himself, even though the frosting leaned to one side every single year. We laughed about it every time. "Perfect cakes belong in bakeries," he'd tell me with that crooked smile. "The homemade ones belong with people who love each other." After he was gone, those birthdays became harder, but my children helped fill the silence. At least they used to. A week before my birthday, my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, called while I was trimming roses in the backyard. "Margaret," she said, without even asking how I was doing, "we're going to cancel your birthday dinner this year." I paused with the pruning shears still in my hand. "Cancel it?" I asked softly. "Everyone's schedules are packed," she replied. "Between work, the kids, and everything else, nobody has time." Before I could answer, Ethan's voice drifted into the phone from somewhere behind her. "Tell Mom she'll understand." Vanessa laughed lightly before returning to me. "See? It's really no big deal." I forced a smile, even though she couldn't see it. "Of course," I said. "Don't worry about me." 2 days later, Ethan stopped by after work. He didn't come inside right away. He stood on the porch with his hands buried in his jacket pockets, avoiding my eyes. "Mom," he began, "Vanessa feels bad. But honestly, you're 68 now. Birthdays aren't that important anymore." I stared at him for a second, longer than I intended. "Maybe not," I answered, "but people usually are." His shoulders shifted uncomfortably. "You know that's not what I meant." I nodded because arguing would only embarrass him. Ethan had never been cruel. He had simply spent years choosing the easier silence over uncomfortable truth. That habit had slowly become part of who he was. After he left, I carried the empty watering can back into the garage. The evening sun stretched long shadows across the driveway, and for the first time since Robert died, the house felt unfamiliar. It wasn't because it was empty. It was because I suddenly realized how invisible I had become inside the lives I had spent decades helping build. Emily called that night from Portland. "I heard about the birthday," she said carefully. Vanessa says everyone's just busy. I waited for something else. For her to say she'd visit anyway. For her to tell me she thought it was wrong. Instead, she sighed quietly. Maybe next year will be easier. Maybe, I replied. We said goodnight a minute later. I sat alone in the kitchen with the old ceramic mug Robert bought me during our anniversary trip to Oregon 20 years earlier. Outside, the wind carried the scent of salt from the Pacific. Inside, only the refrigerator hummed softly. I told myself I wasn't upset about missing a birthday dinner. I was grieving something much harder to name. Respect doesn't usually disappear overnight. It fades one quiet moment at a time until one day you wake up and realize people have stopped seeing you altogether. That night, before I turned off the lights, I glanced at the family calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. My birthday had been erased with a single black marker line. Beneath it, someone had written a new reminder in Vanessa's handwriting. Saturday, Vanessa's birthday celebration. Private event. I stood perfectly still, staring at those words, unaware that this tiny discovery was only the first thread of a truth far bigger than anyone in my family realized. I stood in front of that calendar for a long time before I finally reached up and touched the black line crossing out my birthday. It was only ink on paper, but somehow it felt heavier than that. I closed the refrigerator door, turned off the kitchen light, and carried my tea into the living room where Robert's photograph still sat on the oak side table beside his favorite reading chair. "You always said people tell you who they are," I whispered to the empty room. Maybe I just refused to listen. The truth was, none of this had begun with my birthday. That calendar simply forced me to see a story that had been unfolding for years. After Robert passed away, I told myself our family only needed time to heal. Ethan and Vanessa had been overwhelmed with raising two young children. Emily had built a new life in Oregon, with a demanding career. I understood busy lives because I had lived one myself. So every holiday, every birthday, every missed phone call, I found an excuse for them before they ever had to make one. When Ethan forgot to call on Mother's Day, he apologized 2 days later. "Work has been crazy, Mom." I smiled and answered, "I know, sweetheart." When Emily canceled Thanksgiving because airfare had become too expensive, I mailed presents to Portland anyway. "Next year," she promised. There was always a next year. Somehow next year never arrived. Vanessa had a gift for making every decision sound perfectly reasonable. "Margaret," she would say with that polished smile, "it just makes more sense this way." At first, those changes seemed small. She rearranged holiday dinners because her parents preferred eating earlier. Christmas morning moved to her house because it was more convenient for the children. Easter brunch shifted to a country club halfway between both families because, according to Vanessa, fairness mattered. Fairness became an interesting word. It usually meant I drove farther, adjusted more, and expected less. One afternoon nearly 3 years earlier, I had spent 6 hours helping Vanessa prepare for her neighborhood charity luncheon. I folded napkins, polished serving trays, and arranged flowers from my own garden. As guests began arriving, I quietly slipped into the kitchen to refill the lemonade pitchers. I overheard one woman ask, "Who is that helping you?" Vanessa glanced toward the kitchen without lowering her voice. "Oh, that is Ethan's mom. She likes staying busy." The woman smiled politely. "How nice!" Vanessa laughed softly. She would probably be lonely otherwise. I remember standing there holding a glass pitcher while the ice cubes slowly melted against my fingers. It was not what she said. It was how easily she reduced my whole life to a sentence. She never mentioned that I volunteered twice a week at the local library. She never mentioned the scholarship fund Robert and I quietly supported for local high school students. She never mentioned that half the roses decorating her tables had come from my own yard. I had become useful background, not someone to introduce with pride. That evening, Ethan noticed I was unusually quiet while loading dishes into the dishwasher. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked. I looked at him and wondered whether he had heard the conversation. "Do you ever notice how people describe each other?" I asked. He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," I said after a moment. "Just something I was thinking about." He accepted the answer because accepting easy answers had become second nature. Robert had never been like that. If something seemed wrong, he stayed until he understood it. Sometimes I missed that almost as much as I missed him. There were other little moments that settled quietly into my heart. Family photographs where I somehow ended up standing at the edge while everyone else crowded into the center. Dinner conversations that continued right over me after I spoke. Decisions already made before anyone remembered to ask my opinion. None of those moments were dramatic enough to complain about. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. A month before my birthday, I invited everyone over for Sunday dinner like I had done for decades. I roasted chicken, baked cornbread, and made Robert's favorite peach cobbler. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa glanced at her phone and smiled. "My birthday party is going to be incredible this year," she announced. "I found the perfect event planner." Emily smiled through the video call on the tablet. "I already booked my flight." Ethan looked up. "Dad would have loved seeing everyone together." For a brief second, my heart warmed. Then Vanessa continued. "We are renting the ballroom at the Monterey Bay Hotel. Live music, catered dinner, professional photographer. It is going to be unforgettable." "That sounds wonderful," I said sincerely. "What weekend?" She told me the date. The same weekend that had once been reserved every year for our family's quiet tradition of celebrating my birthday together. Nobody seemed to notice the coincidence, except me. Or perhaps they noticed, and simply decided it no longer mattered. That night, after everyone left, I gathered the empty dessert plates and found a folded receipt tucked beneath one of them. It had slipped from Vanessa's purse without her realizing it. Across the top were the words, "Monterey Bay Hotel Event Services." At the bottom was a handwritten note from the planner that made my stomach tighten. "Looking forward to celebrating Vanessa's birthday with all 48 guests." I stared at that number for several seconds. 48 people had found time for her celebration. Apparently, not one had found time for mine. I folded the event planner's receipt and slipped it back into the envelope where I had found it. For a brief moment, I considered calling Ethan. I imagined saying, "Son, I know there is enough time for 48 guests. I know there is enough money for a ballroom and a photographer. So tell me honestly, why was there no room left for me?" But I never made the call. There are questions that deserve answers, and there are questions that only reveal how little someone values the person asking them. I was not ready to hear that answer. The next morning, I drove into downtown Carmel to return a stack of books to the public library where I volunteered every Tuesday. The ocean breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and cypress trees, and for an hour or two I almost forgot about the calendar, the receipt, and the ache quietly settling into my chest. Mrs. Helen Morris, who had volunteered beside me for years, noticed I seemed distracted. "Everything all right, Margaret?" she asked as we sorted donated novels. I smiled gently. "Just one of those weeks." She looked at me for a second longer than usual before nodding. Sometimes people forget how much they lean on the strongest person in the room. I laughed softly. "I am not sure anyone has been leaning on me lately." Helen reached over and squeezed my hand. "Do not mistake silence for your value." Her words stayed with me all afternoon. When I returned home, I found a package resting on my porch. It was addressed to Robert Collins, even though he had been gone for 9 years. The return address belonged to an old law office in Monterey. I carried it inside, intending to set it aside with the rest of Robert's papers, but before I could place it on the desk, my phone rang. Vanessa's name appeared across the screen. "Hi, Margaret," she said cheerfully. "I wanted to remind you not to stop by the hotel this Saturday." I frowned. I was not planning to. "Good," she replied. "The guest list is very carefully planned, and we really want everything to feel exclusive." There was a short pause before she continued. "I hope you understand." I looked toward the unopened package lying beside Robert's photograph. "Exclusive," I repeated quietly. "Yes," she said. "Some events are simply not meant for everyone." Before hanging up, she added one more sentence that settled over me like cold rain. "Besides, it would probably make everyone uncomfortable if you came unexpectedly." The line went silent. I lowered the phone without realizing I was still holding my breath. I had spent decades teaching my children that kindness costs nothing. Somewhere along the way, someone had convinced them that compassion was optional. That evening, Ethan called. His voice sounded tired. "Mom, Vanessa told me she spoke with you." "She did." He hesitated. "Please do not take it personally." I closed my eyes. "What exactly should I not take personally, Ethan?" He struggled to answer. "The party is mostly for friends our age. It would feel different." "Different because I am your mother?" He exhaled slowly. "That is not what I meant." "Then tell me what you meant." Another silence filled the space between us. Finally, he said, "Can we just not argue?" I almost smiled. That had become his solution to everything. If nobody talked about the hurt, perhaps it did not exist. "I am not arguing," I answered softly. "I am listening." After we ended the call, I sat beside the fireplace until sunset painted the living room walls with warm orange light. My eyes drifted back to the unopened envelope from the law office. Something about seeing Robert's name written so neatly across the front made me pause. It felt as though the past itself had knocked on my door. I carefully opened the package with an old letter opener Robert had received as a retirement gift. Inside was a thick folder and a handwritten note from an attorney I vaguely remembered meeting years ago. The note began simply, "Dear Mrs. Collins, if you are reading this, there is something your husband specifically asked us not to deliver until several years after his passing." My heartbeat quickened. I had never heard Robert mention anything like this. Beneath the note rested another sealed envelope, this one bearing my name in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. My fingers trembled as I traced each familiar letter. Before I could break the seal, headlights swept across my front window. A car door slammed outside, followed by hurried footsteps climbing the porch. Then came 3 urgent knocks at my front door, one after another, far louder than any neighbor would ever knock. I slipped Robert's unopened letter beneath the folder before walking toward the front door. The knocks came again, firm but not angry, the kind of knock that carried urgency instead of impatience. When I opened the door, I found an older gentleman standing beneath the porch light, his silver hair stirred by the evening breeze coming off the Pacific. He removed his hat the moment our eyes met. "Mrs. Margaret Collins?" he asked politely. "Yes." He smiled with unmistakable relief. I was hoping I had the right house. "My name is Charles Whitmore. I am the senior partner at Whitmore and Ellis in Monterey. I am afraid I may have startled you." I looked at the folder still resting on the hallway table behind me. "You sent the package." He nodded. "I did." When we did not receive confirmation that it had arrived, I decided I should bring the original documents myself. I stepped aside. "Please, come in." Charles entered slowly, looking around the living room with quiet appreciation. His eyes stopped on Robert's photograph beside the fireplace. He smiled warmly. He always kept that same smile, even during the most difficult meetings. I felt my heart tighten. "You knew my husband well?" "Better than most people realized," he answered. "Robert was my client, but more importantly, he became my friend. I invited him to sit while I prepared fresh coffee. As I carried 2 mugs back into the living room, Charles looked toward the bookshelves lining the far wall. He built those himself, did not he? I laughed softly for the first time in days. He insisted no store-bought shelf would ever be strong enough. Charles chuckled. That sounds exactly like Robert. We sat quietly for a moment before he reached into his leather briefcase and removed another envelope sealed with the firm's crest. "Mrs. Collins, your husband left very specific instructions. He wanted several matters to remain private for a number of years after his passing. Those years have now elapsed." I looked at the envelope but did not reach for it. Why now? Charles folded his hands together. "Because Robert believed there would come a day when you would need to remember exactly who you are before anyone else tried convincing you otherwise." His words settled over me with unexpected weight. He had no way of knowing about Vanessa's phone call, or the canceled birthday, or the quiet loneliness that had filled my home all week. Yet somehow, his timing felt almost impossible to ignore. Before I could ask another question, the doorbell rang again. Charles glanced toward the hallway. "Are you expecting someone?" "No." When I opened the door, I found Helen Morris standing beside Walter Hayes, one of Robert's oldest friends. Walter had served with Robert in the Army Reserve decades earlier, and even in his late 70s, he still carried himself with quiet discipline. Helen smiled apologetically. "We hope we are not interrupting." Walter looked past me into the house and suddenly froze. "Charles Whitmore," he said with surprise. Charles stood immediately. Walter Hayes. The 2 men crossed the room and shook hands like old friends reunited after many years. "I had no idea you still came out this way," Walter said. Charles smiled. "Only when something truly matters." Helen looked from one face to another. "Now I feel like I have walked into a reunion." They all laughed gently, and for the first time in several days my living room felt warm again. Walter turned toward me. "Margaret, I stopped by because I wanted to see how you were doing." He hesitated before adding, "Robert asked a few of us to keep an eye on you, not because he thought you needed protecting, because he knew you would spend your life taking care of everyone else while forgetting yourself." Charles nodded quietly. "That sounds exactly like the man I knew." Helen smiled at me. "You know, people around Carmel still tell stories about you and Robert. The library scholarship, the winter food drives, the families you helped after the wildfires. Some of the younger volunteers think those programs were started by the city." I blinked in surprise. "They were never about recognition." Walter smiled gently. "Which is exactly why people remember." Charles looked directly at me. "Mrs. Collins, I have represented business owners, judges, veterans, and public officials for more than 40 years. Your husband admired many people. I can count on one hand the people he truly respected." He paused before continuing. "You were at the top of that list." I felt tears gather despite my efforts to remain composed. For years I had quietly wondered whether my life had slowly become invisible. Yet here were people speaking about a version of me my own family no longer seemed able to see. Charles slid the sealed envelope across the coffee table. "Robert wrote this entirely by hand. He instructed me never to explain its contents, only to make certain you opened it when the time was right." My fingers rested lightly on the envelope, tracing Robert's familiar handwriting once more. Before I could break the seal, Walter suddenly frowned toward the front window. A luxury SUV rolled slowly past the house before stopping across the street. The headlights remained on. None of us recognized the driver, but whoever sat behind that windshield was clearly watching my front porch. None of us spoke for several seconds. The headlights remained fixed on the front of my house, washing pale light across the roses Robert had planted so many years ago. Walter quietly stepped closer to the window, careful not to draw attention to himself. "Do you recognize the vehicle?" he asked. I slowly shook my head. "No." Charles glanced outside before calmly returning to his seat. "Whoever it is, they can wait. Some things deserve our attention first." His steady voice settled the room. The uneasiness did not disappear, but it no longer controlled the moment. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, and Robert's handwriting was as familiar to me as my own reflection. I broke the seal carefully, almost afraid that unfolding the pages would somehow erase the last thing he had ever written to me. The first line stopped me cold. "My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, then enough time has passed for people to show you who they truly are." My eyes filled before I reached the second sentence. Robert had always been the only person who called me Maggie. Even after 40 years of marriage, hearing that name again felt like hearing his footsteps coming through the front door after work. I continued reading silently while the others respectfully looked away. Robert did not write about money. He did not write about property. Instead, he wrote about character. He reminded me of the countless evenings we had spent delivering groceries to families who had lost everything after the coastal storms. He reminded me of the scholarship dinners where we sat quietly in the back so the students would never feel indebted to us. He reminded me of conversations I had almost forgotten, when we promised each other that kindness should never depend on applause. One sentence lingered longer than all the others. "The world may someday overlook your worth, but that does not reduce your value by even a single penny." I lowered the letter into my lap. Helen gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "He knew exactly how to speak to your heart," she whispered. Charles nodded. Robert spent months preparing those letters. Every word was intentional. Walter smiled softly. "That sounds like him." He never rushed anything important. Charles reached into his briefcase once more and removed a slim leather binder. "There is one more thing Robert asked me to deliver personally." He handed it to me with both hands. Across the front was embossed a simple title, Collins Community Foundation. I frowned in confusion. I have never seen this before. Charles was careful with his words. Very few people have. He opened the binder to the first page. Instead of financial statements, I found photographs. There were smiling students standing beside scholarship certificates, families receiving house keys after rebuilding from wildfire damage, veterans attending holiday dinners, library renovations, children's reading programs. In nearly every photograph, I recognized someone whose life had quietly crossed ours years ago. Yet Robert and I were rarely in the pictures. "You hid all of this?" I asked. Charles smiled. "No, you simply never sought recognition." Helen leaned closer, studying one of the photographs. Suddenly, her eyes widened. "Margaret, this is Daniel Foster." I looked more carefully. A young boy stood beside me holding a backpack nearly as large as he was. I remembered him immediately. His father had died unexpectedly, and his mother had struggled to keep food on the table. Robert and I had quietly paid for Daniel's tutoring for 3 years, without ever telling anyone. "Daniel," I whispered. Helen laughed softly through her tears. "He is chief of surgery now at Community Hospital in Monterey." Walter chuckled. "He still talks about the woman who convinced him he could become anything." I stared at the photograph, hardly believing that frightened little boy had become the respected physician everyone now admired. Charles turned another page. There was a handwritten note attached beneath a group photograph. "Margaret believed in us before we believed in ourselves." It was signed by 6 different names. I recognized every one of them: teachers, nurses, business owners, ordinary people who had once needed a little help and had never forgotten it. "Why did Robert keep all this?" I asked quietly. Charles looked directly at me. "Because he worried that one day you would begin measuring yourself through the eyes of people who had forgotten your worth." The room fell silent. Outside, the unfamiliar sport utility vehicle finally pulled away from the curb and disappeared around the corner. None of us noticed. We were all looking at the pages spread across my coffee table, pages that quietly revealed a lifetime I had almost convinced myself no longer mattered. Then Charles reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and paused before removing one final sealed envelope. Unlike the others, this one carried a bright red stamp across the front that read, "To be opened only if Margaret ever questions her place in this family." My breath caught. Beneath the stamp was one final sentence written in Robert's unmistakable hand. "This is the truth I hoped you would never need to know." My fingers rested on the final envelope for what felt like several minutes. No one urged me to hurry. Charles quietly stirred the coffee that had long since gone cold. Walter stood by the fireplace with his hands folded behind his back, while Helen watched me with the kind of patience only true friends seem to possess. I finally broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. The handwriting was unmistakably Robert's. Strong, careful, and deliberate, just like the man himself. "My dearest Maggie," the letter began. "If this letter is ever opened, it means someone has made you question whether your life mattered. I pray that day never comes, but I know people can lose sight of what has always been standing in front of them." I smiled through my tears. Robert always had a way of saying exactly what needed to be said without raising his voice. I continued reading silently. He wrote about our marriage, our children, and the countless ordinary days that had quietly shaped our lives. Then his words shifted. "If our family ever forgets who you are, it will not be because you changed. It will be because comfort has a way of hiding sacrifice." My heart tightened. I remembered the nights I stayed awake sewing Halloween costumes after working all day. I remembered postponing graduate school because Ethan needed braces and Emily wanted to attend summer music camp. I remembered selling my mother's antique jewelry to help Robert start his architecture firm when the bank refused another loan. None of those choices had ever felt like sacrifices at the time. They simply felt like love. Charles spoke gently after I lowered the letter. "Robert asked me to witness the signing of that document personally. He knew this day might come?" I asked. Charles nodded slowly. He hoped it never would, but he understood human nature better than most people. Walter walked over and rested one hand lightly on my shoulder. "Robert worried that one day people would remember what you gave them without remembering who gave it." Before anyone could speak again, my telephone rang. The screen displayed Ethan's name. I looked at it for several seconds before answering. "Hello, sweetheart." His voice sounded strained. "Mom, where are you?" I glanced around my own living room and almost laughed at the question. "At home. Vanessa stopped by earlier," he said. "She said nobody answered. I was with guests." There was another pause. "Mom, did someone from Dad's old law office contact you?" I looked toward Charles. He quietly nodded, giving me permission to answer however I wished. "Yes," I replied calmly. Ethan inhaled sharply. "I thought so. Why?" Another silence followed. Finally, he admitted, "Vanessa found an old file in our attic this afternoon. It mentioned Whitmore and Ellis. She became worried." "Worried about what?" His answer came slowly. "She said maybe Dad left something we did not know about." I closed my eyes for a moment. Even now, after everything, the first concern was not whether I was all right. It was whether there might be something hidden. "Ethan," I said softly. Your father left many things behind. What does that mean? Mostly lessons. He did not answer. We ended the call a minute later with no anger between us, only a distance neither of us quite knew how to cross anymore. Helen sighed quietly after I set the phone down. He sounds frightened. Charles folded Robert's letter with great care. Fear often appears when assumptions begin to fall apart. Less than an hour later, another car pulled into my driveway. This time I recognized it immediately. Vanessa stepped out before the engine had fully stopped. She walked briskly to the front porch and knocked without waiting. When I opened the door, her smile looked forced. "Margaret," she said quickly, "I heard Mr. Whitmore is here." "He is." Her eyes shifted past me until they landed on Charles. "Good evening," she said politely, though her voice carried an unmistakable edge of nervousness. Charles stood and offered a courteous nod. "Mrs. Collins." Vanessa stepped inside without being invited, something she had done many times before. Tonight, however, it felt different. Her eyes immediately noticed the open binder. The photographs spread across my coffee table, and Robert's handwritten letters resting beside them. "What is all this?" she asked. I answered honestly. "Memories." She forced a small laugh. "Well, I mean, legal documents." Charles spoke before I could respond. "Private family correspondence." Vanessa folded her arms. "I am family." His expression remained calm. "You are indeed part of the family. That does not automatically make every document yours to review." A faint flush appeared across her face. "I was only asking." Walter quietly observed the exchange without saying a word. Helen busied herself gathering empty coffee cups, giving Vanessa every opportunity to regain her composure. Instead, she looked directly at me. "Margaret, if this has anything to do with Robert's estate, Ethan deserves to know immediately." I met her eyes without anger. "If there is something your father-in-law wanted Ethan to know, I trust Robert arranged it exactly as he intended." She looked surprised by my calmness. Perhaps she had expected an argument. Instead, the silence seemed to unsettle her far more. Just then, Charles reached into the binder and carefully removed a single notarized document. He looked at me before speaking. "Mrs. Collins, with your permission, I believe the time has come to explain why Robert instructed our firm to protect these records for nearly a decade." Every eye in the room turned toward him as he placed the document on the coffee table. Across the top, in bold letters, was a title none of us expected to see. Charles rested his hand lightly on the document before looking around the room. Nobody spoke. Even Vanessa, who only moments earlier had tried to sound confident, stood perfectly still. The title across the top of the page read, "Collins Community Foundation Charter and Stewardship Agreement." It sounded formal, almost ordinary, until Charles began explaining why Robert had created it. "Robert believed that generosity should outlive both of you," he said calmly. "He established the foundation years before his passing. It has quietly supported scholarships, veterans assistance, library programs, emergency housing, and local families facing hardship." Vanessa blinked. "I have never heard of it." Charles nodded. "That was intentional." He turned one page and continued. "Neither Robert nor Margaret wanted public recognition. Every donation was made anonymously, unless the recipients insisted otherwise." Walter smiled to himself. "That sounds exactly like the two of you." Helen gently picked up another photograph from the coffee table. "I volunteered beside Margaret for almost 15 years, and even I never knew the full story." Charles looked directly at me. "Mrs. Collins, Robert appointed only one permanent steward of this foundation." I frowned slightly. "Robert handled all of those matters himself. During his lifetime, yes," Charles answered. "But after his passing," he slid the document toward me. "Near the bottom, Beneath Robert's signature and two notarized seals appeared my own name, Margaret Ann Collins, sole lifetime steward. I stared at it in disbelief. He never told me. Charles smiled gently. He believed you would have refused the responsibility if he had. Vanessa stepped closer to the table. What exactly does that mean? Charles answered without hesitation. It means Mrs. Collins alone determines how the foundation fulfills Robert's charitable vision. No other family member may alter its purpose or direct its activities. Vanessa forced a small laugh. Well, that is symbolic, I suppose. Charles calmly shook his head. No, Mrs. Collins. It is a legally binding governance structure. I noticed the color drain slightly from her face. Before she could respond, the front door opened again. Ethan stepped inside, breathing a little harder than usual, as though he had driven faster than he should have. He looked from Vanessa to Charles, then finally to me. Mom. I stood and embraced him. For a brief second, he hugged me the way he had when he was a frightened little boy after waking from nightmares. Then he stepped back and looked toward the papers covering the coffee table. What is going on? Vanessa answered before anyone else could. Apparently your father left all sorts of documents nobody knew about. Ethan looked confused. Nobody? Walter quietly cleared his throat. Your father trusted several people to safeguard his wishes. Ethan turned toward Charles. Why was I never told? Charles met his eyes with compassion rather than judgment. Because your father never intended these documents to become a source of conflict. He hoped they would never be needed. Ethan slowly lowered himself into a chair. I do not understand. Charles opened another section of the binder containing annual reports. There were photographs of completed community projects, letters from scholarship recipients, and summaries of volunteer initiatives spanning nearly a decade. Your mother has unknowingly continued this work, Charles explained. Ethan looked up sharply. What do you mean unknowingly? I answered quietly. I have simply kept volunteering where I always did. Charles smiled. Many of the organizations believed Mrs. Collins was simply another volunteer. They never realized she was personally approving grants through the foundation Robert created. I stared at him in surprise. I approved paperwork because your office asked me to sign documents every year. Charles nodded. Exactly as Robert instructed. He believed you would always make decisions based on compassion rather than recognition. Ethan looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. Mom, all those weekends when you said you were at the library. I smiled softly. Sometimes the library. Sometimes delivering meals. Sometimes reviewing scholarship applications. Why did you never tell us? I shrugged gently. Because helping someone loses something precious the moment it becomes a performance. The room fell silent again. This time the silence felt different. It no longer belonged to embarrassment. It belonged to reflection. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. So everyone is acting as though Margaret has been living some secret life. Her voice carried a hint of frustration. She could have simply told us. Helen looked at her kindly. Did you ever ask? Vanessa opened her mouth, then stopped. Walter quietly added, some people spend their lives speaking, others spend their lives serving. The second group usually leaves the louder legacy. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face. I cannot believe I never noticed. I reached over and touched his arm. Life becomes busy, sweetheart. Sometimes we stop looking beyond our own schedules. He lowered his eyes. That is not an excuse. It was the first time I had heard him accept responsibility without trying to soften it. Vanessa immediately responded. Ethan, you are acting like we did something terrible. He looked at her with visible uncertainty. Did we not? She shook her head quickly. We were busy, that is all. Walter quietly walked toward the front window. Outside, several cars had begun slowing as they passed the house. A young woman stood on the sidewalk, pointing toward my porch while speaking into her phone. Helen joined him and looked outside with surprise. That is strange. Charles removed his glasses and looked through the window as well. I believe, he said thoughtfully, the story is beginning to travel farther than any of us expected. Before anyone could ask what he meant, my telephone buzzed repeatedly across the coffee table. One message after another appeared on the screen. The first was from Daniel Foster, now chief of surgery. The second came from the director of the Carmel Public Library. The third was from the mayor's office. Each message contained nearly the same opening sentence. We just heard what happened to you, and we need to speak with you as soon as possible. The messages continued arriving faster than I could read them. My telephone vibrated across the coffee table until Helen finally smiled and placed it gently into my hands. You should answer at least one of them, she said. The first call came from Daniel Foster. His voice carried the same warmth I remembered from the shy little boy who used to sit at my kitchen table struggling through his math homework. Mrs. Collins, he said, I only just learned what happened. I wish I had known sooner. I smiled softly. Life keeps us all busy, Daniel. He became quiet for a moment. Busy should never become an excuse for forgetting people who shaped our lives. Before ending the call, he added, there are many of us who owe you far more than we have ever said out loud. When I placed the phone back on the table, Ethan was staring at the scholarship photographs spread across the binder. His eyes lingered on faces he now recognized from around town. I have worked with some of these people for years, he murmured. They all knew. Charles gently corrected him. They knew someone believed in them. Most never knew who that someone was. Ethan lowered his head. I did not even know my own mother. No one answered because there was nothing left to add. Truth has a way of filling every empty space without anyone raising their voice. Vanessa stood near the front window, scrolling nervously through her own telephone. The confidence she had carried into my house earlier had quietly disappeared. Her expression changed with every passing second. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, people are talking about us. Ethan looked up. What do you mean? She turned the screen toward him. The neighborhood community page was filled with photographs that someone had posted years earlier from charity events, library fundraisers, veterans' dinners, and scholarship ceremonies. In photograph after photograph, Robert and I appeared quietly in the background. Beneath the images were hundreds of comments from people sharing stories about unexpected acts of kindness that had touched their families. One woman wrote that her daughter had become the first college graduate in their family because of an anonymous scholarship she had only recently learned came from the Collins Community Foundation. A retired firefighter shared that emergency repairs after the wildfires had arrived just when his family believed they would lose everything. Another post simply read, some people spend their whole lives making our town better without ever asking for credit. Then the conversation shifted. Someone mentioned my canceled birthday. Another person recognized Vanessa's public photographs from the lavish birthday celebration at the Monterey Bay Hotel. The dates matched. People began asking questions that none of us could answer with easy explanations. No insults appeared, no cruel words, only disappointment. Quiet disappointment can sometimes carry far more weight than anger. Vanessa slowly lowered the telephone. This is not fair, she whispered. Walter looked at her with compassion rather than judgment. Fairness is often the moment when private choices become public consequences. She shook her head. People do not understand the whole story. Helen answered gently. Neither did Margaret. The room fell silent again. Ethan stood and walked toward the family photographs displayed above the fireplace. He stopped in front of one, taken nearly 15 years earlier at the beach. Robert stood with one arm around me, while Emily and Ethan laughed beside us. "When did we stop being this family?" he asked quietly. I walked over and stood beside him. "Families rarely change all at once," I said. "Usually they drift one small decision at a time." Tears gathered in his eyes. I kept choosing the easier conversation instead of the right one. I placed my hand over his. "Then choose differently tomorrow." Across the room, Vanessa slowly sat down in the chair closest to the window. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed less concerned about defending herself than understanding what had happened. "I thought birthdays were just parties," she admitted. "I never realized what canceling yours actually meant." I answered honestly. "It was never about the dinner." She looked at me through tearful eyes. "It was about belonging." I nodded. "Yes?" She covered her face with both hands. "I spent so much time trying to create perfect memories that I erased someone else's." Charles quietly closed the binder. "Regret cannot rewrite yesterday," he said. "But it can become the beginning of a different tomorrow if it is sincere." Several weeks passed after that evening. The conversations throughout Carmel slowly settled. The attention moved on, as it always does, but relationships did not return to where they had been. Ethan began stopping by every Sunday without waiting for an invitation. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we simply shared coffee in comfortable silence. Emily flew in from Portland one rainy weekend and apologized for all the moments when silence had seemed easier than showing up. Vanessa stayed away at first. I suspected she believed I no longer wished to see her. Then, one cool morning, as autumn painted the cypress trees in muted shades of gold, I heard a gentle knock at my front door. When I opened it, she stood there alone with no carefully prepared speech, no expensive gift, and no attempt to justify the past. Tears rested quietly in her eyes as she whispered, "Margaret, if you are willing, may I come inside? There is something I have needed to say for a very long time." I stepped aside without saying a word, and Vanessa entered the house as quietly as though she were afraid even her footsteps might disturb the peace. The morning sunlight spilled through the living room windows, resting on Robert's old reading chair and the framed photograph that had remained in the same place for nearly a decade. I walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle with water. Some conversations deserve coffee. Others deserve tea. This one needed tea. Vanessa stood near the window with her hands folded tightly together until I placed a warm cup in front of her. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Finally, she looked up. "I practiced this conversation 100 times," she whispered. "None of the words sound right anymore." I nodded gently. "Sometimes there are no perfect words." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I have spent weeks replaying everything in my head. Your birthday, the phone call, the things I said, the things I did not say." She looked down at the steam rising from her cup. "The worst part is realizing none of it happened because I hated you. It happened because I stopped seeing you as a person who could still be hurt." Her honesty settled quietly between us. There was no excuse hidden inside her confession, no attempt to shift blame, only regret. "I thought I was organizing schedules," she continued. "I thought birthdays were just events on a calendar. I never stopped to think that I was canceling the one day each year that reminded you of the life you built with Robert." I smiled sadly. People rarely break hearts on purpose. Most hearts are broken by people who become careless. She wiped her eyes. "I cannot ask you to forget." "No?" I answered softly. "Some memories should stay exactly as they are, because they teach us who we never want to become again." She reached into her purse and carefully placed something on the table. It was a handwritten birthday card. The date in the corner showed it had been written several weeks earlier. "I bought this before everything happened," she said. "Then I convinced myself there would always be another day to give it to you." I opened it slowly. Inside, her handwriting trembled across the page. It simply read, "Thank you for loving this family long before I ever became part of it. I wish I had remembered that sooner." I closed the card and reached across the table, gently resting my hand over hers. "Forgiveness," I said quietly, "is not the same as returning everything to the way it was." She nodded before I had even finished speaking. "I know. Trust grows slowly, just like a garden." She glanced toward the backyard where Robert's roses still bloomed. "Then I will earn it one season at a time." A few days later, Ethan came over carrying a toolbox. "I noticed the back gate does not close properly anymore," he said. "I thought I could fix it." I smiled because he finally understood something his father had always known. Love is often spoken through ordinary acts. He repaired the gate, replaced 2 loose porch boards, and stayed for lunch. We talked about Robert. We laughed about the birthday cakes that always leaned to one side. For the first time in many years, there was no hurry to leave. Emily visited more often as well. She no longer waited for holidays. Sometimes she simply drove down from Portland for a weekend so we could walk along Carmel Beach with coffee in our hands and no agenda at all. "I spent too many years believing there would always be another visit," she admitted one afternoon. "I forgot tomorrow is never promised." I squeezed her hand. "Now you remember." The seasons quietly changed. Winter gave way to spring, and spring welcomed another birthday. This time, I did not wait for anyone to organize a celebration. I invited the people who had remained present, not only in moments of joy, but also in moments of silence. Helen brought homemade pie. Walter carried fresh flowers from his own garden. Daniel arrived straight from the hospital, still wearing his white coat beneath a light jacket. The library volunteers laughed as they filled my small dining room with stories that stretched back decades. Ethan and Emily came early to help set the table. Vanessa quietly arranged the flowers without asking where they belonged. She had learned to help without needing recognition. Before we shared dessert, Ethan stood and cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, his voice unsteady. "For years I believed providing for my family meant working harder and scheduling everything perfectly. I forgot that showing up is its own kind of love. Thank you for giving me the chance to become a better son." I walked over and hugged him. There was nothing left to prove. Some victories arrive without applause. They arrive as peace. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I carried my teacup into the backyard. The roses swayed gently beneath the fading California sunset. Beside them stood the old wooden bench Robert had built with his own hands. I unfolded his letter one last time and tucked it carefully beneath a smooth stone inside the small garden where he had planted the first rosebush all those years ago. The letter had done what it was meant to do. It reminded me that my worth had never depended on being noticed. It had always lived inside the quiet choices I made every single day. I sat on the bench until the first stars appeared above the cypress trees, listening to the evening breeze moving gently through the garden we had planted together. In that moment, I realized I had not reclaimed my old life. I had grown into a new one. If you have ever felt invisible inside your own family, I hope you remember this. Never measure your value by the attention someone gives you in a single moment. Measure it by the kindness you continue to carry, the boundaries you choose to protect, and the peace you refuse to surrender. You can forgive without abandoning your self-respect. You can love others without losing yourself. The people who truly belong in your life will never ask you to shrink so they can feel bigger. If this story touched your heart, I would be grateful if you left a like, subscribed, and shared it with someone who may need this reminder today. The greatest revenge is never making someone suffer. It is refusing to let their choices define your worth. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until our paths cross again in another story, I hope your days are filled with peace, your heart remains strong, and you always remember that you have never been invisible to the people who truly matter.